I can still see the dining room that night. The table was set perfectly, the kind of spread my mother-in-law always prided herself on. Crystal glasses, polished silverware, the roast sitting in the middle as if this was some picture-perfect family gathering. But perfect has a way of hiding cracks. And that night the crack split wide open. Her smirk came first, my husband's sister, Melissa. She leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine like she was about to make some clever joke at my expense. And then she said it, right in front of everyone. If you went missing tomorrow, nobody would even notice. The room froze for half a beat, and then laughter. My husband chuckled nervously, his parents shifted uncomfortably, but not one person told her she'd gone too far. Not one. They laughed except me. I didn't laugh. I didn't even flinch. I lifted my own glass, raised it just high enough for her to see, and I smiled, calm, deliberate. Challenge accepted, that's all I said, and in that moment I knew something they didn't. I meant it. The air shifted, but only inside me. They thought it was just sarcasm. Another empty comeback to brush aside. But deep down I was already finished with them, all of them. That night, my silence was louder than their laughter. I watched their faces as they carried on eating, pretending nothing had been said. My husband avoided my eyes. Melissa smirked like she'd won something. And his mother filled the silence with forced chatter about the weather, the garden, anything to cover the ugliness they had allowed to live at that table. But what they didn't see was the promise forming in my mind. That night wasn't just another family dinner. It was the last time they would ever sit across from me and laugh at my expense. You see, for years I had swallowed their little jabs, the side comments about my clothes, the way they treated me like I didn't belong, the way my husband sat silent while his family chipped away at me piece by piece. I played the role. I smiled when I was supposed to. I stayed quiet when I wanted to scream. But everyone has a breaking point. Melissa thought her cruel joke was harmless, that it would fade into the noise of all the others. But she was wrong. Those words didn't fade. They burned. And as I sat there, raising my glass, smiling like I always did, something shifted in me permanently. I made up my mind before dessert was even served. That would be the last dinner they'd share with me. The last night they'd laugh at my silence. The last time they would mistake my composure for weakness. They thought I'd stay. They thought I'd always come back to the table no matter how unwelcome they made me feel. But what they didn't realize was that I had a choice. And that night I chose to disappear. And I didn't leave a note. I didn't give them a warning. I didn't even slam the door. I simply vanished. No forwarding address. Just silence. For them it was sudden. For me it was the first moment I'd breathed in years. One night they laughed at me. By morning I was gone. And as you'll soon see, when a woman leaves quietly, she doesn't just take herself. She takes the peace they never appreciated. She takes the stability they took for granted. And eventually she takes their power. They thought they could erase me with laughter. A year later it's their names, their reputations, their lives that are the punchline. Because while they mocked me at that dinner table, I was planning the one thing they never expected. They thought I'd sit there and laugh it off. But I had something else in mind. If this is your first time coming across one of our stories, welcome. Please hit the like button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And don't scroll away because what happened next, no one saw coming. And if you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. When I first married Daniel, I believed love would shield me from everything. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but he was steady, calm, and I thought that meant he was strong. I was young, hopeful, and naive enough to think that marriage was just about two people. What I didn't understand was that I hadn't only married Daniel, I had married his family too. From the very beginning, Melissa made sure I knew my place. She was Daniel's older sister, sharp-tongued and relentless. On the surface, her comments passed as jokes, little jabs at my cooking, at the way I dressed, at how I talked too much or stayed too quiet. It didn't matter what I did. She always found the crack in it and widened it for everyone else to see. At first, I brushed it off. That's what you're supposed to do, right? Families tease each other. And I wanted so badly to be accepted. I told myself not to take it personally. But acceptance never came. Every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday dinner at their house turned into a test I could never pass. Melissa was a master at disguising cruelty as charm. In front of neighbors or guests, she could tilt her head, smile, and say, "Oh, she tries so hard, bless her heart." Everyone would laugh, assuming she meant it lightly. But her eyes always lingered on me, sharp and deliberate, daring me to react. I didn't. Not once. I bit my tongue, tucked my hands into my lap, and let the laughter roll over me like waves I couldn't fight. I thought Daniel would step in, That he would see how his silence cut deeper than her words ever could. But he never did. He'd squeeze my hand under the table, whisper that it wasn't worth the fight, and beg me with his eyes to let it go. Let it go. That was the anthem of our marriage. Let it go when his sister excluded me from conversations. Let it go when his mother introduced me to her friends as Daniel's wife, but never by my name. Let it go when his father compared me to Daniel's ex-girlfriend who, according to him, fit into the family like a glove. And I let it go, over and over again. Because I loved him. Because I thought loyalty meant swallowing my pain, so he wouldn't have to choose between me and them. But love doesn't survive on silence, and loyalty feels like betrayal when it only flows in one direction. The dinners became a theater of humiliation. I'd walk in with a dish I'd spent hours preparing, only for Melissa to sniff it and say, "Oh, how creative," before sliding it to the edge of the table untouched. She'd raise her glass to toast the people who really hold this family together. And my name was never included. Sometimes, when I excused myself to the bathroom, I'd return to whispers. Her voice low and sharp, followed by chuckles from the others. They never stopped talking when I walked back in. They just changed the subject. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was as subtle as the way chairs filled up around the table, leaving me at the far end, half cut off from conversation. Or how family photos were taken without anyone thinking to call me over. The message was always the same. I was temporary, disposable, forgettable. Daniel would drive us home afterward and tell me not to cry, not to let them get to me. They don't mean it, he'd say. But meaning doesn't matter when you feel the sting in your bones. Every ride home was the same. Me staring out the window, blinking back tears, him promising it would get better. It never did. Over the years, I became an expert at disguising myself. I'd plaster on a smile, laugh when I was supposed to, pretend their words didn't bruise me. On the outside, I looked composed, collected, maybe even indifferent. But inside I was unraveling thread by thread. Because when people strip you down with small, cutting remarks, it isn't just about the words. It's about erasing you until you start to wonder if you really exist at all. Still I endured. I told myself marriage is about compromise, about patience, about family. I clung to the hope that if I just kept showing up, one day they would see me for who I really was, and not the caricature Melissa painted of me. But that night, when Melissa smirked across the dinner table and said, "If you went missing tomorrow, nobody would even notice," something in me snapped. It wasn't the first insult. It wasn't even the worst. But it was the last. Because in that moment, it hit me. She wasn't wrong about how they saw me. To them, I was invisible. Replaceable. My absence would be an inconvenience at best, a joke at worst. And if my own husband couldn't find the courage to stand up for me in that moment, he never would. For years, I had told myself that keeping the peace was worth it. That biting my tongue was better than starting a war I couldn't win. But sitting at that table, listening to their laughter echo in my ears, I realized something I should have seen long ago. Peace is worthless when you're the only one bleeding to keep it. And for the first time in my marriage, I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel embarrassed. I didn't even feel angry. I felt done. But that night, her words hit differently. I wasn't just hurt, I was done. I remember the first time I understood what it meant to be on the outside of a family you were supposed to belong to. It wasn't at that dinner table where Melissa made her cruel joke. No, it had been building for years, stacked brick by brick in moments that most people would have brushed off as thoughtless oversights. But they weren't oversights. They were choices. Small, deliberate choices that reminded me I was never going to be one of them. One Christmas stands out most clearly. Though it wasn't the only one. Daniel had begged me to come, insisting it was important that his family wanted me there, that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. I spent hours finding the right gifts, wrapping them with care, hoping that when they opened them, they would see the thought I had poured into each one. I told myself this was how families built connections, how bonds were formed, through traditions, laughter, shared joy. When we arrived, the house was strung with lights, the smell of cinnamon and pine heavy in the air. Everyone was already gathered around the tree, their gifts neatly stacked. I placed ours beside theirs, eager to join in. And then it started, the gift exchange. Names were called, laughter bubbled, paper tore, and everyone's arms filled with boxes and ribbons. But as the pile dwindled, I noticed something. My name was never called. No gift had my name written on it. I sat there smiling, pretending it didn't sting, while Melissa unwrapped a pair of diamond earrings from her parents and Daniel received a new watch. His father made a joke about how men like him deserved to be rewarded. The others clapped and laughed, while my lap stayed empty. When the last bow was untied and the last bag was tossed aside, I glanced at Daniel, waiting for him to say something, anything. He gave me that nervous half-smile I knew too well. The one that begged me not to ruin the evening. Later, in the car, I asked him why nobody thought to include me. He sighed, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. "It's just how they are," he said softly. "Don't take it personally." But how could I not? How could being erased, year after year, be anything but personal? It wasn't just Christmas. It was birthdays too. Family photos where I was asked to take the picture instead of being in it. Conversations at Sunday dinners that slid past me as though I weren't sitting right there. Plans made for vacations that I only heard about after the fact, when they were already posting photos on social media. And every time Daniel chose silence, he told himself, and me, that he was keeping the peace, that it wasn't worth stirring up drama. He would tell me later, once we were alone, that he loved me, that his family just didn't know me well enough, that things would change with time. But the time never came. Silence became his shield, and it left me exposed. I began to wonder what peace he was protecting, because it certainly wasn't mine. His family continued their rituals of exclusion, and he continued to sit in the middle, never rocking the boat. He called it compromise. To me, it felt like abandonment. The loneliness crept into our marriage like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. At first it was subtle, me lying awake while he snored beside me, my mind replaying moments at the dinner table where I'd been the punchline. Then it grew heavier. Conversations between us that turned shallow, me learning to stop confiding in him because his answers were always the same. "Don't let it get to you." But it did get to me. It got to me every time Melissa looked at me like I was an intruder. Every time his mother spoke over me. Every time his father compared me to someone else. It got to me when I realized that in my own home, with my own husband, I was carrying a silence that wasn't mine to carry. I started to feel like a ghost in my own marriage. Present but unseen. Breathing but unheard. Smiling but empty. I dressed the part of the dutiful wife, played along with the charade of belonging, but inside, a part of me was disappearing. That Christmas night, sitting in the car with Daniel's watch glinting on his wrist while my hands sat empty, I realized something I had been too afraid to admit. I wasn't just fighting against Melissa's cruelty, his parents' indifference, or the family's refusal to let me in. The truth was heavier than that. I realized then, I wasn't just battling them. I was invisible in my own marriage. The night of that dinner is carved into my memory with a clarity that almost feels cruel. The table looked as though it had been lifted straight from a magazine. Candles glowing in crystal holders, steam rising from platters, silver polished to a shine. But behind the glittering surface was the same cold truth I had known for years. I did not belong there. Melissa sat across from me, her posture relaxed, her voice loud enough to command the room. She had always enjoyed being the center of attention, and her parents allowed it, as if the rest of us were merely supporting actors in her stage play. I listened to her chatter about her new job, her plans for a trip, the compliments she claimed strangers gave her in passing. She thrived on the sound of her own voice, and then she turned to me. I should have known something was coming. I could feel it in the way her lips curved just before she spoke. She leaned back, took a slow sip of her wine, and with that same smile she'd worn since childhood, she said the words that cracked the air like glass breaking. "If you went missing tomorrow, nobody would even notice." For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that presses down on a room, where everyone is waiting to see what happens next. Then came the laughter, scattered at first, then rolling together. Her father chuckled. Her mother shook her head like it was harmless mischief, and even Daniel forced out a strained laugh. It was as though they had all silently agreed to treat cruelty as comedy, and I was the only one who hadn't received the script. I didn't laugh. My face didn't move. Inside my chest tightened, my pulse quickened, but on the outside I was still. I reached for my glass, lifted it with a steady hand, and let the words fall with a calmness I didn't even know I possessed. Challenge accepted. The laughter faltered, replaced by a few awkward glances. Melissa raised her brows, clearly amused, as if she believed I was playing along. Daniel shifted in his chair, uncomfortable, but said nothing. The moment passed, swallowed quickly by the clatter of forks and the return of meaningless conversation. They thought I was joking. They thought my words were nothing more than sarcasm, a weak attempt to meet Melissa at her own game. To them, it was a line to be brushed aside, forgotten before dessert was served. But I knew the truth. My glass wasn't raised in jest. It was a vow. I looked around that table, at Melissa with her self-satisfied grin, at his parents so eager to look away from cruelty if it kept the peace, at Daniel whose silence had become as familiar to me as the sound of my own breathing, and I understood, with sudden certainty, that nothing would ever change. Not if I stayed. Not if I kept pretending. I realized I had two choices: continue to shrink in their shadows until there was nothing left of me, or walk away and reclaim the parts of myself I had buried to survive. And as the candlelight flickered across their faces, the choice became startlingly clear. I smiled to myself, small and unnoticeable, and I began to plan. While they laughed and ate, while they poured more wine and exchanged inside jokes that left me excluded once again, I mapped out the beginning of my escape in the quiet corners of my mind. No outburst, no confrontation, no final plea for Daniel to stand by my side. Just silence. The kind of silence they would never see coming. I decided, right there, surrounded by people who delighted in my invisibility, that I would make myself disappear for real. Not in death, but in absence. I would give them exactly what Melissa had said, only she would never laugh about it again. I sat through the rest of that dinner with a calm so absolute it startled even me. Every word, every fake laugh, every clink of silverware felt like the final chapter of a book I no longer wished to read. By the time dessert was served, I had already closed it. When Daniel placed his hand on my knee under the table, the gesture that once promised comfort now felt hollow, meaningless. I knew he wouldn't defend me. Not tonight, not ever. His silence was permanent, and I had finally learned to stop expecting it to change. I looked at him, at all of them, and it was as though I was seeing clearly for the very first time. These were not my people. This was not my home. And this was not the life I wanted to carry until my last breath. So while they laughed, I memorized every detail. The smirk on Melissa's lips, the indifference in his mother's eyes, the slight slump in Daniel's shoulders. I locked it away not as pain but as proof. Proof that leaving was not betrayal. Proof that leaving was survival. By the time we stood to leave that night, my mind was already made up. The decision felt final, sharp, irreversible. That very night I started my plan. That night, after the dinner, I lay beside Daniel in our bed, listening to the rhythm of his breathing as he drifted into sleep. He had no idea what was circling through my mind. He never did. His world was comfortable, predictable. Mine had been carefully restrained, pressed flat so it wouldn't disturb his peace. But my thoughts that night refused to be silenced. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, my body still, while my mind raced with the clarity of a plan I knew I could no longer ignore. I didn't move immediately. To disappear without warning, I would need precision. The family that mocked me so casually would also mock my absence if I left carelessly. I wasn't going to give them that. I wanted to vanish so completely that my silence would echo louder than any outburst ever could. So I started with the small things. The first step was paperwork. I knew where our marriage license was kept, where our bank statements were filed, where Daniel's documents sat in neat folders. I began to quietly gather my own: birth certificate, social security card, passport, things no one ever noticed until they were gone. Each evening while Daniel showered or went out to run errands, I would slip one more document into an envelope I kept hidden in the bottom of a shoebox in the closet. I told myself not to rush. Each piece of paper was a brick, and I was building my own foundation. The next step was money. For years, Daniel managed most of the accounts, but I had always kept a separate savings, small, discreet mine. He knew about it in theory, but he never asked. He assumed it was insignificant. He was wrong. Every time I grocery shopped, I skimmed just a little, paying in cash and tucking the change away. Every freelance job I'd done, every birthday check from an aunt or friend, I had quietly deposited into that account. By the time I began planning my disappearance, it was enough to start over, though not comfortably. Comfort wasn't the point. Freedom was. I remember the first night I sat with my laptop open, the glow of the screen painting the room while Daniel slept. My hands shook as I typed the words, "women's shelters near me." It felt like betrayal just to search it, as if the computer itself might expose me. I cleared my history, closed the screen every time I heard him shift in bed. But I kept searching. I learned about safe apartments, temporary housing, organizations that helped women walk away when no one else believed they could. Then my searches grew bolder. How to change your address without family knowing. How to rent an apartment without using your spouse's information. How to start over in another city. With every click, my fear grew, but so did something else. A feeling I hadn't tasted in years: control. There were nights my chest tightened so much I had to step into the bathroom just to breathe. I would lock the door, lean against the sink, and stare at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked back like a stranger. Tired eyes, hollowed cheeks, a woman who had learned to shrink in silence. I'd whisper to myself, "You're not crazy. You're not weak. You're just done." It was the first time I had spoken those words aloud, even if no one else could hear them. But not every night was strength. Some nights, when Daniel rolled over and pulled me close in his sleep, I would feel the ache of what we once had. I remembered the man who had made me laugh, who had promised to protect me, who had sworn I would never feel alone again. And I would cry quietly, the tears soaking into the pillow while he remained unaware. It wasn't easy to plan an escape from the life you had once begged for. The heartbreak was real, even as the empowerment grew. I learned to hide my fear beneath routine. In the mornings, I cooked breakfast as if nothing had changed. I kissed him on the cheek, nodded when he told me he'd be late from work. In the evenings, I asked about his day, pretended to care about stories of office politics and traffic. All the while, I was slipping one step further away from him, from them, from the life they believed I would endure forever. There was a thrill in the secrecy, a pulse in my veins I hadn't felt in years. Each envelope of cash tucked into my purse, each password I reset and kept to myself, each apartment listing I bookmarked, it all gave me a quiet rush. They had taken my laughter, my place at the table, my voice. But they hadn't taken my will. And now, for the first time in years, that will was leading me somewhere else. It was strange, how liberation and grief could live side by side. One moment I felt like a coward, sneaking around in the shadows, preparing to vanish without so much as a word. The next, I felt like a warrior, finally arming myself for the battle they never thought I would fight. Each stolen moment of planning was a step closer to freedom. And with every step, I began to see a different version of myself, one that wasn't defined by Melissa's sneer, by his parents' indifference, or by Daniel's silence. I knew leaving wouldn't erase the years I had endured. The scars were already etched too deep, but it would give me the one thing they had denied me over and over again: choice. My choice. So night after night, in the quiet of our home, I pieced together my escape. They thought they had won. They thought their silence had defeated me. But the truth was, every cruel remark, every overlooked moment, every dinner where I was invisible had only sharpened my resolve. And while they slept peacefully, believing I would always be there to fill the empty chair, I was building the life where that chair would sit vacant. It was the first time in years that I felt alive. The first time in years that I wasn't just enduring, I was preparing. And with every document hidden, every dollar tucked away, every late-night search cleared from the history, I could feel the end coming closer. It wasn't fear that carried me anymore. It was power. Quiet, steady, unstoppable power. Because I knew when the time came, I wouldn't just leave a house. I would leave their world. And once I walked away, I would never let them touch me again. The night I vanished was ordinary to anyone looking in from the outside. Dinner had been uneventful. Daniel had eaten in silence, scrolling on his phone between bites. Melissa had called him earlier, laughing so loudly through the speakerphone that I could hear every word from the kitchen. His parents had left another message, a reminder about some family gathering I hadn't been invited to. It was all so familiar, so routine, that it made the finality of what I was about to do feel almost surreal. I moved through the evening like a shadow, unnoticed. I washed the dishes slowly, letting the warm water run over my hands, memorizing the way our kitchen looked, the chipped counter by the stove, the curtain that always hung crooked, the faint smell of Daniel's cologne lingering in the air. I told myself to take it in, because I would never stand there again. When he finally went to bed, his usual exhaustion carrying him quickly into sleep, I sat quietly at the edge of the bed. For a moment, I just watched him. His face was peaceful, younger in rest, the same face I once trusted without question. My heart ached, but it wasn't love anymore. It was grief for the years I had lost, for the woman I could have been if I hadn't tied myself to this life. I leaned down, not to kiss him, but to whisper goodbye in my own head. He would never hear it, and that was how it needed to be. The plan was simple, though my hands trembled as I followed through. I went into the closet and pulled out the small duffel I had hidden weeks before. Inside, I placed the envelope of documents I had collected, the cash I had saved, a few clothes, and the one photograph of myself from before I was married, a reminder of the girl I once was. I left behind my wedding ring. I placed it neatly on top of the dresser, not out of sentiment but as a symbol. This was the end of the version of me who had been theirs to dismiss. I didn't write a note. I didn't send a message. I wanted my silence to be the answer to every moment they had tried to erase me. A note would give them words to twist, explanations to mock. Silence would leave them with nothing. When I finally zipped the bag, the sound was so loud in the quiet house that my heart raced. I froze, listening for movement, for the sound of Daniel stirring, but there was nothing. Just his steady breathing, oblivious to the storm unraveling around him. I slipped my shoes on by the door, the weight of them heavier than I remembered. The keys, cold in my palm, felt like both a weapon and a lifeline. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but standing there, the reality pressed down hard. This wasn't just leaving a man. This was leaving years of humiliation. Every insult that stung but I had swallowed. Every gathering where I was invisible. Every night I cried into a pillow while the world went on without noticing. I wasn't just leaving him. I was leaving them all. I pulled the door open slowly. The hinges groaned, and I winced, holding my breath. For one suspended moment, I thought he would wake, come rushing down the hall, demand to know what I was doing. But the house stayed still. No footsteps. No voice calling my name. Just silence. The air outside hit me like a wave. It was colder than I expected, sharp against my skin, almost cleansing. I tightened my grip on the bag, stepped over the threshold, and closed the door behind me. The click of that lock was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the final note of a life I had endured. The punctuation to a chapter one would never reopen. I stood there on the porch for a moment, staring at the dark street, my body trembling from head to toe. It wasn't relief yet. It was fear, raw and unfiltered. For the first time in years, there was no plan to fall back on, no schedule dictated by someone else, no family to judge me into submission. There was only me and the bag in my hand and the road ahead. As I walked down the steps, I didn't look back. Not once. I refused to give the house that power. Every step away was heavy, but it was mine. My own. When I reached the end of the street, I paused. The world looked the same. Quiet houses, streetlights buzzing softly, but I knew I had crossed a line I could never return from. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it. I already knew it was nothing that mattered anymore. The night swallowed me as I walked, the silence pressing close, and for the first time in years, no one was watching me. No one was waiting to laugh at my expense. No one was deciding my worth. The moment the door shut behind me, I wasn't a wife. I wasn't a daughter-in-law. I wasn't the woman who swallowed her pride at family dinners just to survive another evening. I was free. But freedom, I realized in that first breath of cold night air, was terrifying. Because I had no idea what waited for me beyond the darkness. The apartment I found was nothing like the house I had left behind. And yet, to me, it was a palace. It was small, just one bedroom, a narrow kitchen with cupboards that squeaked, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of bleach no matter how much I scrubbed. The walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbor's television late into the night. But it was mine. Every corner, every flaw, every imperfection belonged to me. I rented it under a different name, one I had chosen carefully, almost like trying on a new skin. I was no longer Daniel's wife or their daughter-in-law. I was a woman without history, without chains. For the first time in years, the silence around me wasn't heavy. It was freedom humming in the air. Those first mornings, I would wake up disoriented, half expecting to hear Daniel's footsteps or his phone buzzing with Melissa's name flashing across the screen. Instead, all I heard was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. At first, it felt lonely, almost unbearable, like the weight of all the years I had lost pressed down on me. But slowly it shifted. The loneliness began to transform into solitude, and solitude became something sacred. Money was tight, but I had planned for that. I kept my expenses small, stretching every dollar. And then I found a job at a little bookstore cafe tucked away on a quiet street. When I walked in the first time to apply, the smell of roasted coffee beans and the faint must of old paper wrapped around me like a blanket. The owner, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, didn't ask too many questions. She just looked at me, at the way I clutched the application form like it was a lifeline, and said softly, "You can start Monday." That job became more than work. It became my anchor. Each day I brewed coffee, arranged books on shelves, and wiped down tables, and with each task, I felt pieces of myself returning. Customers came and went, some stopping to chat, others lost in their novels, and for the first time in years, people saw me not as an extension of someone else, but simply as myself. The girl behind the counter with tired eyes but a soft smile, no shadow of a family waiting to undermine her. I began to notice the little joys that had been absent from my life, the way the light streamed through the cafe windows in the late afternoon, painting the floor in golden squares. The sound of pages turning as someone settled into a book. The warmth of a mug in my hands during a break, steam rising into my face. Simple things that had been drowned out by years of noise, judgment, and betrayal. In the evenings, I would return to my apartment, curl up on the couch with a book, and let the words carry me away. Stories became my companions, tales of resilience, of women who endured and emerged stronger. I underlined passages that spoke to me, scribbling in the margins like I was rewriting myself one line at a time. I started making friends in small, cautious ways. A young woman named Claire who worked part-time at the cafe shared her dreams of becoming a writer. A quiet man named James, who always came in at the same time every Thursday, began to leave little notes recommending books he thought I'd enjoy. At first, I kept my distance, afraid that letting anyone close would risk exposure. But their kindness chipped away at the walls I had built around myself. These were people who knew nothing of Daniel, nothing of Melissa, nothing of the suffocating family dinners. They only knew me, the person I was becoming. And in their eyes, I was not invisible. There were nights when the past haunted me, when memories crept in like ghosts. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments I wished I could forget. The laughter of his family at my expense, the coldness in his eyes when I begged for understanding, the way Melissa smirked when she thought she had one. Those nights hurt, but instead of breaking me, they became fuel. Each painful memory reminded me why I had walked away, why silence had been my loudest weapon. Healing came slowly in fragments. The first time I laughed without forcing it, I startled myself. The first time I sang softly to the radio while cleaning the kitchen, I paused, realizing how long it had been since music felt safe. The first time I looked in the mirror and didn't see failure but possibility, I cried. I began keeping a journal, scribbling down my thoughts late at night. At first, it was messy, anger spilling onto the pages, grief pouring out in shaky lines. But soon, hope began to appear between the words. I wrote about the strength I was rediscovering, about the quiet joy of independence, about the plans I was beginning to dream for the future. My journal became a map of my healing, guiding me forward, reminding me of how far I had come. One evening, after closing the cafe, I walked home under the streetlights. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. I stopped in the middle of the street, and just looked up at the sky. It was so vast, so endless, scattered with stars. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped beneath it. I felt part of it, small yes but free. In that moment I realized I was no longer just surviving. I was living. Piece by piece I was building a new life, one they would never touch, one they would never destroy. And though fear still lingered, though shadows of the past still reached for me, I finally understood that I was stronger than all of it. I had disappeared from their world, but I was finally reappearing in my own. And that, more than anything, was the beginning I had been waiting for. I didn't go searching for news about them in those first weeks after I vanished. I didn't want to know if Daniel was sleepless with worry, or if Melissa was smirking in victory. I wanted distance, silence, separation. But no matter how far I tried to run, pieces of information found their way back to me. Through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances, through social media posts I stumbled across by accident, through whispers that floated back like smoke from a fire I had left burning behind me. The first thing I learned was that Daniel panicked. At first, he played the part of the concerned husband, calling old friends, asking if anyone had seen me, pacing like a man whose world had slipped from his hands. But those who knew him closely began to notice the cracks in his performance. They said his panic didn't look like love. It looked like fear. Fear of questions. Fear of judgment. Fear of exposure. His family wasted no time stepping into the narrative. They whispered among themselves, careful at first, then bolder. They told anyone who asked that I had left him, that I couldn't handle the pressures of marriage, that I was too fragile for responsibility. They painted me as unstable, as weak, as someone who couldn't withstand the normal trials of life. I became the runaway wife in their story, the fragile woman who snapped under the weight of reality. Melissa, of course, couldn't resist making it public. I later saw a post she had written, her words dripping with false pity but laced with mockery. Some women just aren't built for commitment, she wrote, adding a smiley face that made my blood boil when I saw it. They crumble instead of standing strong. A real woman doesn't run when things get hard. She didn't mention my name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. For a moment, their version of events seemed to gain traction. A few acquaintances posted vague comments about how marriage takes resilience, how some people just don't have it. My name wasn't mentioned, but I felt it hanging in the shadows of their words. Daniel's family nodded along, smug, convinced they had successfully reshaped the story of my disappearance into one of my weakness. But then something unexpected began to happen. Whispers shifted direction. Neighbors, the ones who had seen me come and go over the years, the ones who had noticed my quietness at family gatherings and the way my eyes dimmed when Melissa spoke, began to question the narrative. They had seen the way Daniel spoke to me in public, his sharpness disguised as jokes, his dismissiveness veiled as humor. They remembered the night of that family dinner, how laughter had filled the room at my expense. They recalled Melissa's smirks, the way Daniel's mother had looked through me instead of at me. What they remembered didn't fit the story of a fragile woman who ran away. It painted a different picture, one of a woman surrounded by cruelty, isolated in plain sight. And people began to talk. Rumors grew like weeds in the cracks of Daniel's carefully laid facade. Maybe she left because she was unhappy, someone whispered. Maybe she was pushed too far. Another neighbor commented that she had seen me carrying groceries alone most of the time, that Daniel rarely helped. Someone else remembered how Melissa always seemed to hover around him. Too familiar, too comfortable. The story his family tried to control began to slip away from them. It turned into a question mark instead of a period. Where had I gone? Why had I left without a word? What kind of home drove a woman to vanish in the middle of the night with nothing but a bag? Daniel's panic grew heavier. He stopped pretending to be the concerned husband and started lashing out. A mutual friend told me he snapped at people for asking questions, that he grew defensive whenever my name was mentioned. His anger only added fuel to the fire, making people wonder what truth he was trying so hard to bury. Melissa, too, found her mockery backfiring. That smug post of hers drew comments she hadn't expected. "Strange how quick you are to speak on someone else's marriage," one person wrote. "Aren't you a little too invested?" another added. What she had intended as a public joke became a mirror reflecting suspicion back at her. And slowly, the whispers around them turned sharp. People started to look at Daniel and his family not as victims of my supposed weakness, but as possible architects of my silence. The neighbors who had once laughed at their jokes now watched them with raised eyebrows. Acquaintances who once pitied Daniel now wondered what kind of man drove a wife away so completely. The narrative shifted, and for the first time I realized something powerful. By saying nothing, I had given their lies enough rope to strangle themselves. My silence was louder than any defense I could have spoken. And while I sat in my tiny apartment, sipping coffee after my shift at the bookstore cafe, watching the sun sink beyond the city skyline, I smiled faintly to myself. Because the story they tried to spin had started to backfire. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when the truth first reached me, not through gossip I sought out, but through the casual slip of a friend's tongue. I was shelving books at the cafe, lost in the quiet rhythm of arranging spines by author, when my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Claire, an old acquaintance who hadn't known much about my disappearance, but had always been kind. She wasn't someone who thrived on drama, which is why her words struck me even harder. "I didn't want you to hear this from anyone else," her message began. My stomach knotted before I even read the rest. She continued, "Daniel has been seen with someone. More than once." For a moment I froze. The hum of the espresso machine, the laughter of students in the corner, the smell of baked goods, it all blurred into the background. My hands trembled against the smooth covers of the books I was holding. I had braced myself for many things when I left, but betrayal still had the power to slice through me like a blade. I tried to tell myself it was just gossip, another exaggeration. But Claire's next message shattered that hope. "It's not new. It's an old flame. You remember Evelyn." Evelyn. The name hit me like a blow to the chest. She was his college sweetheart, the one everyone thought he'd marry before life had pulled them apart. She had lingered in stories, in the corners of his memories he sometimes let slip, always with a tone too wistful for my liking. I had told myself it was nothing, that the past was the past. But now, Evelyn was no longer a ghost. She was real, present, and by his side. When I asked Claire how she knew, she hesitated, then admitted she'd seen them herself. I bumped into them at a restaurant. They weren't hiding it. He had his arm around her like it was the most natural thing. His family was there too. They didn't look surprised. If anything, they looked approving. That was the part that broke me in half. Not just his betrayal, but theirs. My in-laws, the same people who had mocked me, dismissed me, and whispered that I wasn't strong enough, were now pretending this was normal. They had covered it up, spinning my absence as the reason he had moved on. I could already hear Melissa's voice echoing in my head, dripping with false pity. Well, she left him. What did you expect him to do? Stay lonely forever? They had taken my silence and twisted it into a weapon. They weren't just covering for him. They were rewriting the narrative again, painting me as the deserter, the woman who had abandoned her vows, leaving him no choice but to find comfort elsewhere. For a long time I sat in the staff room, staring at the rain streaking down the window. Betrayal burned in my chest, but mingled with it was something strange, something almost like relief. Because in that moment Daniel showed me exactly who he was. The mask had fallen away. The husband I had once loved, the man I had once fought to understand, was gone. What remained was a hollow figure of convenience, loyalty as thin as paper, commitment as fleeting as the wind. And yet, though the revelation crushed me, it also freed me. For months I had wondered if I had been too drastic, if leaving in silence was too cruel, if I had been unfair. But now the answer was clear. I hadn't abandoned a good man. I had escaped a man who would betray me at the first opportunity, who would wrap his arms around an old flame while my absence was still fresh. I remembered the night I slipped away, the fear and trembling that had gripped me, the uncertainty of whether I was doing the right thing. And now, months later, the truth validated every step I had taken. I hadn't been weak. I had been strong enough to walk away before he could destroy me further. Still, the pain was undeniable. Betrayal is never clean. It cuts jagged, uneven lines across the heart. At night, when I lay on my narrow bed in that little apartment, I thought of Evelyn. Did she know? Did she realize she was stepping into the ruins of a broken marriage? Or did she believe his lies, his stories of a wife who had abandoned him without cause? Did she know I existed in the shadows, piecing my life back together while he paraded his new beginning like nothing had happened? I imagined the dinners they shared, the way Melissa Shirley laughed and encouraged the union, already rewriting family history to erase me. I could almost hear Daniel's voice, smooth and convincing, telling Evelyn that he had been the victim all along, that I had walked away and left him shattered. I wondered if she believed him, or if deep down, she saw through his cracks the same way I once had. But amid the bitterness, I felt an odd sense of calm, because betrayal, though painful, was also clarity. And clarity is power. I didn't confront him. I didn't reach out to her. I didn't correct the lies they told. I simply tucked the knowledge deep into my chest like a weapon I would one day use. They thought they had buried me under shame, but every new betrayal they stacked onto my name only built the foundation for something stronger. And in the quiet of my new life, surrounded by books and the gentle kindness of strangers who knew me only as and, I began to craft a thought that would linger with me for months to come. If he could betray me so easily, if his family could erase me so quickly, then I owed them nothing. Not my silence, not my loyalty, not my protection. One day, when the time was right, I would let the truth speak. And when it did, it would not whisper. It would roar. Because the first major betrayal was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs unraveling. And this was the first twist no one saw coming. When the weight of betrayal first settled into my chest, I thought it would crush me. Nights were the hardest. The silence of my small apartment carried echoes of the years I had spent silenced in my own home. Words swallowed, tears hidden, dignity chipped away piece by piece. But one morning, as the sun poured through the blinds, I found myself dialing a number I had avoided for too long. Therapy. Walking into that first session, I felt like a child learning how to breathe again. I sat in the chair, arms crossed, eyes darting anywhere but the therapist's face. She asked me simple questions, ones I thought I could answer easily. How are you feeling today? But my voice caught in my throat. For the first time, someone wasn't asking me to justify, to defend, to smile through it. She was asking me to be honest. And when I finally let the words spill, they came in a torrent I couldn't stop. I spoke about the laughter that cut deeper than knives, about Melissa's smirk, about Daniel's dismissive sighs whenever I tried to voice my needs. I spoke about how I had slowly disappeared in that house, until my reflection in the mirror no longer felt like me. Each sentence I spoke felt like pulling barbed wire out of my chest. Painful but necessary. Week after week, I confronted the shadows I had pushed into corners. I realized how deeply I had been conditioned to believe my voice didn't matter. How often I had been told to calm down. Stop overreacting. Don't make this about you. I realized the silence I had thought was strength was, in truth, survival. And for the first time, I began to forgive myself. Not for leaving, but for staying as long as I did. Therapy became the place where I reclaimed my name, piece by piece. At home, I started journaling. At first, my handwriting was shaky, my words blunt and uncertain. But soon, the pages filled with raw truths I had never dared say aloud. You were never my safe place. I deserved more than scraps. I am not the ghost you tried to make me. Some nights, the ink smeared with tears, but even those smudges became proof. I was no longer bottling it all inside. I was letting it out, one painful confession at a time. Over time, I noticed something. My journal wasn't filled with their betrayals. It was filled with my rebirth. The narrative wasn't about losing a husband or in-laws. It was about rediscovering myself. I had been writing about my resilience, my courage, the fire that had been buried under years of belittlement. One evening after a particularly heavy session, I sat with my journal in my lap and whispered aloud, "This story isn't about them. It's about me." That was the first time I truly felt free. And with freedom came possibility. One afternoon, I walked past the community center bulletin board and stopped at a flyer pinned in bright red, certificate program, creative writing and storytelling. I stood there longer than I should have, my eyes glued to the words. My first instinct was to laugh at the idea. Me? Go back to learning? Chase something just for myself? For years, every decision had been filtered through what Daniel wanted, what his family expected. My dreams had been dismissed as hobbies, indulgences I couldn't afford to entertain. But now no one stood in my way. That night, I sat with my laptop open, the application form glowing on the screen. My fingers hovered over the keys as doubt crept in. What if I failed? What if I wasn't good enough? What if this was just another way to humiliate myself? But then I remembered something my therapist had said. What if you succeed? What if this is the first step toward the life you always deserved? So I filled it out. Every detail. My heart raced as I pressed submit. It wasn't just an application. It was a declaration. A promise to myself that I was done waiting for someone else to validate me. The confirmation email came the next morning. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Congratulations, you've been accepted. I laughed and cried all at once. It wasn't a degree, it wasn't a grand accomplishment in anyone else's eyes. But for me, it was monumental. It was the first stone I laid on the path to a new future. For the first time in years, I had something to look forward to that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. Classes began in the evenings and I'd rush from the cafe, notebook in hand, feeling like a girl discovering color after living in shades of gray. The classroom buzzed with voices, each person carrying their own story, their own dreams. And for once, I wasn't the silent one in the corner. I was part of it. I belonged. Each assignment became more than homework, it became a mirror. I wrote essays that bled honesty, short stories that carried echoes of my life, reflections that reminded me I had always been a storyteller. I had just been silenced too long to realize it. One night as I packed up my books, I caught my reflection in the window. I saw not the woman who had been betrayed, erased, and abandoned. I saw someone stronger, someone braver, someone who had taken her pain and turned it into fuel. That's when it struck me. I had spent years measuring my worth by how well I held a family together that never wanted me. Now, I was building a life that was mine alone. And with each page of my journal, with each lesson in that classroom, with each step toward a career I chose for myself, I was becoming unstoppable. They thought leaving would break me. Instead, it gave me back to myself. And that unexpected strength, it was only the beginning. When I stepped away, I thought I had left the storm behind me. But storms have a way of circling back, unraveling the very foundations of those who built them. And while I was learning to rebuild quietly, piece by piece, Daniel and his family were beginning to unravel in ways they never saw coming. At first, I only heard whispers. A passing comment from a mutual acquaintance. A subtle hesitation in the voice of someone who once praised them endlessly. I brushed it off, thinking it wasn't my concern anymore. But over time, the whispers grew louder, and the cracks in their perfect facade became impossible to ignore. Daniel had always been so composed, so careful about appearances. To the outside world, he was the charming husband, the responsible provider, the golden son who could do no wrong. But beneath that polish was a man who had built his identity on control. Control of me, control of his image, control of the narrative his family crafted. When I disappeared from the picture, he lost his favorite scapegoat. Suddenly, the balance shifted. The cracks began to show. They said he started drinking more heavily. What began as casual glasses of whiskey after work turned into late nights at bars, slurred words, and mornings where he struggled to make it out of bed. His colleagues noticed his tardiness, the half-finished reports. The once sharp man now stumbling through presentations he would have aced before. At first, his boss covered for him. After all, Daniel had always been the dependable one. But patience runs thin when competence fades, and soon even the most loyal colleagues began to question if he was still the man they thought he was. Meanwhile, Melissa, the sister-in-law who once wore her superiority like a crown, was beginning to taste the bitterness of her own poison. Gossip had always been her weapon. She wielded it effortlessly, whispering just enough to plant seeds of doubt, never enough to be caught outright. But gossip is a blade with two edges, and eventually, it cuts the hand that wields it. Her friends grew wary, realizing that if she could laugh at my pain so freely, what was stopping her from turning that same cruelty on them? Invitations stopped coming. Messages went unanswered. The circle of women who once hung on her every word began to shrink. The attention she thrived on evaporated, leaving her restless and angry. I heard that she snapped at her own friends in public, her mask slipping in ways it never had before. She was becoming isolated, though she'd never admit it. And then there were the family dinners, the grand tradition they held as a symbol of unity. Those evenings had once been choreographed performances, each person playing their part, with me silently absorbing the jabs, the jokes, the little humiliations that kept the spotlight off anyone else. But with me gone, there was no easy target. no one to deflect onto. And slowly, their harmony dissolved. I can picture it even now. Daniel, glass in hand, arriving late, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. Melissa, sharp-tongued and defensive, trying to draw laughs but only earning uncomfortable glances. Their parents sitting at the table, forks scraping plates, silence stretching longer than the conversations. Without me there to absorb their venom, they turned it inward. Tiny sparks of irritation grew into arguments. Old resentments long buried began to surface. What they had once painted as a perfect family was revealed for what it really was. A fragile performance, one that couldn't withstand the truth of their own dysfunction. I hadn't broken them, they had simply lost their shield. And without me, the truth of who they were stood exposed. For Daniel, the unraveling was swift. The more his professional life suffered, the more he drank. And the more he drank, the more his temper grew. I heard about shouting matches at family dinners, slammed doors, words that left wounds deeper than they realized. Melissa, no longer adored more cruelly than ever, only to find that her venom carried less power without an audience. And the parents, the ones who once looked at me with thinly veiled disdain, now found themselves sitting in a home that felt colder, emptier, more divided. The very house that had once made me feel invisible was now suffocating them. It's strange how life works. I didn't plan for their decline. I wasn't orchestrating it, wasn't even watching closely at first. I was too busy fighting for my own healing, carving out a life that finally felt mine. But as I grew stronger, freer, more certain of who I was becoming, they grew weaker, more chaotic, trapped in the roles they had written for themselves. Daniel had replaced me quickly, but even that shine was fading. What had once seemed like a triumphant rebound began to look more like desperation. His new relationship was already faltering, whispers of fights spilling into public spaces, his mask slipping further with each passing week. Melissa's laughter rang hollow in the rare moments she was still seen out, her bitterness clinging to her like a second skin. And the family who had always prided themselves on appearances found their veneer cracking under the weight of their own secrets. I didn't need to lift a finger. I didn't need revenge. Their downfall was coming from within, born of the very arrogance and cruelty that had driven me away. And as I watched from the quiet safety of my new life, I realized something profound. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is silence. Because in silence, they were forced to face themselves. And that, more than anything I could have said or done, was destroying them piece by piece. And though their decline had only just begun, it was clear, the storm they thought they had left me and had turned on them instead. There's a part of the story I haven't told yet, the part one kept hidden, even from myself at times. You see, when you live years under the shadow of people who thrive on control, you learn to survive by paying attention to the smallest details. Words left unsaid, patterns of behavior, cracks in their armor. And quietly, almost without realizing, you start preparing for the moment when survival might require more than silence. It might require foresight. For years, Daniel made sure I felt powerless. He held the accounts, he signed the papers, he decided when and where the money flowed. But what he never realized was that invisibility works both ways. When someone treats you as though you don't exist, they rarely notice what you're doing. And while Daniel paraded his dominance, I learned the quiet art of self-preservation. I didn't take money in a rush, didn't sneak cash from his wallet or try to outwit him in the open. That would have been foolish. Instead, I played the long game. Each time he opened a new account and insisted I sign just for formality, I made sure I understood the terms. Every time he dismissed me during meetings with advisors, I sat in silence, nodding, filing away details in the corners of my mind. And when he insisted my name be added to joint accounts for the sake of appearances, he handed me the very weapon that would one day protect me. Over time, I began to redirect small portions, never enough to raise suspicion, always within the limits of what seemed ordinary. A transfer here, a savings bond there. Quietly, steadily, I moved threads of our shared finances into secure places under my name. Investments tucked away. Accounts only I could access. Legal structures that, once in place, could not be undone without my signature. It wasn't greed, it was survival, a safety net woven from the very fabric he had once used to bind me. By the time I walked out that night, disappearing without a word, the groundwork had already been laid. He didn't know it yet, but the empire he thought he controlled was no longer entirely his. The money he boasted about, the accounts he flaunted, the assets he claimed as proof of his superiority, many of them were locked behind doors he no longer had the keys to. When he finally realized, I can only imagine the fury. I wasn't there to see it, but the pieces reached me in fragments. A call from a mutual acquaintance who hinted at Daniel's sudden financial difficulties. A smirk from someone who had once pitied me, now recognizing that I had left with more than just my freedom. He tried to access accounts, only to find my consent required. He tried to touch investments, only to discover my signature was indispensable. He had always believed I was naive, incapable, dependent, but what he never understood was that silence isn't weakness. Silence can be strategy, and that was my revenge. Not loud, not destructive, not fueled by the same cruelty they had shown me. My revenge was survival, ensuring that no matter how much they tried to erase me, I would not vanish into nothingness. My revenge was the quiet certainty that while they spiraled into decline, I had secured a future they could no longer reach. I didn't drain him. I didn't destroy him. That was never the goal. I simply made sure that when I left, I wasn't walking away empty-handed. I made sure the years of my labor, my sacrifices, my silence were not written off as worthless. I made sure I could stand on my own without ever having to return to beg for scraps at a table where I was never respected. And here's the truth that still burns in them, even if they'd never admit it. They expected me to fail. They expected me to come crawling back, broken, desperate, stripped of dignity. Instead, I disappeared into a life of my own making. A life where I didn't need their approval, their money, their name. A life where their voices no longer defined my worth. While Daniel drank himself into oblivion and Melissa choked on the venom of her own gossip, I was enrolling in classes, learning skills, opening doors to a career I had chosen. Not one chosen for me. While they sat at dinners laced with tension and bitterness, I sat in quiet cafes with my books, my plans, my dreams finally unfolding. While their perfect facade crumbled under the weight of its own lies, I was building something real brick by brick, without them ever realizing what I had carried away. They called me weak. They called me foolish. They thought I was the invisible one, the disposable one, the forgettable one. But invisibility has power. It gave me space to plan, space to maneuver, space to outgrow them while they weren't looking. And when I finally stepped away, I did so not with rage, not with screams, not with threats, but with silence. A silence so profound that it echoed louder than any words I could have spoken. And now, every time they glance at the empty seat I once filled, every time they see their carefully crafted image slipping through their fingers, every time Daniel tries to access what he once believed was his alone, they are reminded of me. Not as the woman they diminished, not as the scapegoat they mocked, but as the one who slipped away with her dignity intact and her future secured. That was my revenge. Not destruction. Not retaliation. Just thriving in silence. They thought I was broken. Instead, I was building. 1 year. It's strange how quickly it passed, and yet how much weight it carried. I still remember the night I slipped away, the air thick with the sound of their laughter at my expense, the bitter taste of wine on my tongue, and the quiet vow I made to myself as I vanished into the dark. 1 year later, I stand in a very different world. A world I carved out of silence, out of strength, out of choices no one thought I was capable of making. My apartment isn't extravagant. It isn't filled with the grand things Daniel used to parade in front of guests to prove his success. But it is mine. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf, every plant by the window carries a story of independence. I chose the curtains, I picked the dishes, I arranged the photographs, small reminders of who I was before I was reduced to a shadow. My place doesn't echo with cruelty. It hums with quiet peace. When I walk through the door at night, there is no fear of biting comments, no sharp silence waiting to cut me down. Instead, there's warmth, the kind you build slowly day by day with your own 2 hands. A year ago, laughter was something I feared. In that house, laughter was never with me, only at me. But now I laugh freely. At silly television shows, at books that make me chuckle, at dinners with a handful of people I've let back into my circle. Real laughter. The kind that doesn't hide daggers behind it. The kind that heals. And dinners, how different they feel now. Gone are the endless nights of carefully arranging myself at the table, waiting for the inevitable jab from Melissa, waiting for Daniel to smirk as he let her words twist the knife deeper. Now my dinners are simple. Sometimes it's just a bowl of soup. Sometimes it's friends gathered with takeout containers spread across the table. There's no performance, no perfect image to uphold. Just food, conversation, and peace. Things I never realized I had been starving for until I finally tasted them. Work, too, has become something more than a necessity. I started small, taking a job that didn't impress anyone but gave me stability. Slowly, I climbed, learning skills, earning respect on my own merit. There's a steady paycheck, yes, but more than that, there's pride. For the first time, my value isn't tied to someone else's name or someone else's permission. It's mine. My effort, my success. And that, to me, Feels like wealth Daniel could never buy. But while my world has grown, theirs has shrunk. The cracks that once began as whispers have deepened into chasms they can't conceal. Neighbors who once adored their carefully crafted image now avert their eyes. The laughter that used to roar through their dinner parties has dwindled into silence. Invitations that once flowed endlessly into their mailbox have all but dried up. The world they built on gossip and cruelty has turned its back, leaving them to choke on the very isolation they once wished upon me. Daniel, from what I hear, has lost his edge at work. The drinking that once numbed him has begun to define him. He shows up late, disheveled, distracted. The colleagues who once respected him now whisper behind his back, the same way he once encouraged others to whisper about me. Melissa, too, has found herself on the outside. The friends who once delighted in her gossip eventually became her victims. And as her venom spread, people grew wary. She thought her cruelty was a form of power, but in the end, it poisoned her circle until none remained. And the family dinners, those grand occasions that once left me feeling like prey in a room full of predators, have lost their shine. Without me to target, the tension has turned inward. Their laughter doesn't flow the same way. Their smiles are thinner, strained. Even the younger ones, the nieces and nephews who once giggled at Melissa's cutting remarks, now sense the hollowness. What was once a performance of unity has become a fragile act no one believes anymore. It's almost poetic. While I built quietly, they unraveled loudly. While I stitched my life back together in silence, they tore theirs apart trying to hold on to appearances. While I learned to live without cruelty, they discovered how empty life feels when cruelty is the only thing binding you together. And so here I am 1 year later, standing in a place they never thought I'd reach. Stronger, softer too, more myself than I've been in years. I no longer measure time by their moods, no longer shape my words to avoid their wrath. I measure it in the books I've read, the laughter I've shared, the meals I've enjoyed, the nights I've slept in peace. There are still scars, yes. Some nights I wake from dreams that drag me back into that dining room, that house, that life where I was invisible. But then I open my eyes and I see the world I've built. I remind myself that the scars aren't signs of weakness, they're proof of survival. Proof that I left, that I endured, that I thrived. And though they may never admit it, I know they feel my absence. Not because they miss me, not truly, but because without me their world has no scapegoat, no outlet, no one to absorb their venom. Without me they are forced to face each other, to see the reflection of their own cruelty staring back at them. A year ago they thought I had disappeared into nothingness. They thought silence would mean defeat, that my absence would leave me forgotten. But in truth silence became my shield. And as their world fractured and mine expanded, the lines between us grew clearer than ever. 1 year later I am no longer their victim. I am no longer their shadow. I am simply me, free, steady, alive. And that is a kind of revenge they will never recover from. The letter arrived folded neatly inside a plain envelope. No return address, no handwriting I didn't recognize. The way he wrote my name, hesitant, shaky, made me pause longer than I should have. For a moment, I almost didn't open it, but curiosity has a way of slipping past even the strongest defenses. Inside it was short. Just a plea. A string of desperate words from the man who once believed I could not live without him. He wrote of regret, of sleepless nights, of a house that no longer felt like home. He wrote of silence, not mine but his. The laughter that used to roar in those walls had evaporated. Melissa had turned on him, friends had abandoned him. Colleagues no longer respected him. He was adrift, and in his desperation he wrote to me, "Please meet me. Just once." For days I debated. Part of me wanted to tear the letter in half, toss it into the trash, and let that be the end of it. But another part, the part that had carried the weight of unanswered questions, knew I needed to see him, not for his sake but for mine. Closure wasn't about forgiveness. It was about ending the chapter with my head held high. So I agreed. A quiet cafe, one tucked away from the neighborhoods we once haunted, one where the air didn't carry ghosts of our past. I arrived early, choosing a corner table where the light from the window spilled across the wooden surface. My hands rested calmly around my coffee cup. There was no fear in me this time, no dread of what words he might wield. I was not the same woman he had known. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. Daniel, once so polished, so meticulous, looked hollowed out. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his posture bent beneath invisible weight. The arrogance he used to wear like armor had cracked, leaving behind only a man undone. He spotted me and hesitated, as if my presence startled him. Perhaps he expected the ghost of the woman he broke. Instead he saw me, steady, composed, unshaken. He sat across from me, his hands trembling as he wrapped them around the coffee cup the waiter set down. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I watched him, and he watched me, the silence stretching like a mirror he couldn't bear to face. Finally, he whispered, "You look different." I smiled faintly. "I am." He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he searched for words. He rambled about mistakes, about pressures, about the way Melissa had manipulated him. He spoke of loneliness, of nights filled with bottles instead of peace, of a family unraveling without the scapegoat I once provided. He wanted me to believe his regret was genuine, that his pain somehow balanced the scales. But I didn't flinch. I didn't reach across the table. I didn't offer him comfort. I simply listened. And when his words ran dry, when his desperation hung in the air between us, I leaned forward slightly and said, "Thank you." He blinked, confusion flickering in his tired eyes. "Thank you." "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Not for the marriage. Not for the years I lost in that house. But for teaching me how to walk away. For showing me what I will never allow in my life again. You taught me that silence can be strength. You taught me that survival sometimes means leaving everything behind. So yes, thank you." His face crumpled then, a mix of disbelief and sorrow. He reached out, as though grasping for something to anchor himself to. But I didn't give him the satisfaction of my hand. Instead, I stood, gathering my bag, my coat, my composure. He whispered my name, barely audible, as if saying it might tether me to him again. But I didn't answer. I pushed back my chair, and with one final look, calm, resolute, free, I turned and walked toward the door. The bell above the cafe chimed softly as I stepped into the cool air outside. I didn't look back. Not once. Because the truth was simple. There was nothing left behind me worth returning to. The life I had built, the woman I had become, the peace I carried, that was forward, not back. And as I walked away, I realized that was the sweetest revenge of all. Not anger. Not vengeance. Not even his regret. Just my freedom, untouchable, undeniable. For years they had believed I was powerless. That without them I was nothing. But now, as their world crumbled and mine thrived, the truth was clear. I had never been nothing. I had simply been waiting to become everything I was meant to be. And that is where my story ends. Not in defeat, not in bitterness, but in strength. A strength no one can take away. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been laughed at, pushed aside, or silenced, remember this. Your silence can be your greatest weapon, your disappearance your loudest statement. Never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on them. Walk away if you must. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply living well and living free. When I look back now, it isn't the cruelty that lingers, not the mocking laughter at that dinner table, not the cutting remarks that chipped away at me, not even the betrayal that ran so deep it nearly hollowed me out. What lingers is the silence I chose afterward, the deliberate step away from their chaos, the decision to no longer participate in their cruelty, their drama, their shallow performances. That silence was my shield and eventually my triumph, because revenge isn't always loud. It isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes it's quieter than a whisper. Sometimes it's simply absence, your absence. It's walking away and leaving them with their own reflection, their own lies, their own consequences. The world has a way of unraveling those who thrive on cruelty. Sooner or later, the mask slips, the charm fades, the alliances fracture. And without you there to absorb the blows, they turn on each other. That is exactly what happened. They buried themselves with the very weapons they once used on me. I didn't raise a hand. I didn't shout. I didn't fight in the ways they expected. I just left. I chose my peace over their approval. And that choice gave me back everything they thought they had taken. My laughter, my dignity, my freedom. To every woman who has been told she's too quiet, too soft, too invisible, I want you to hear this. Your strength doesn't have to roar to be powerful. Your silence, your resilience, your refusal to be broken, that is a language louder than cruelty will ever be. You don't have to destroy someone to win. Sometimes just choosing yourself is enough. Because walking away isn't weakness. It's wisdom. It's looking at the battlefield and deciding it's not worth bleeding for. It's realizing that the war was never yours to fight, because their downfall was always inevitable. And when it comes, you won't need to lift a finger. Their own choices will be the undoing. Justice without noise, that is what I found. Not through courts or confrontations, not through screaming matches or grand gestures. Just silence and the steady work of rebuilding myself. And in that rebuilding, I became stronger, steadier, and freer than I had ever been. And in the end, that's the sweetest justice of all, that I no longer carry their names like a burden, but they will always carry mine like a ghost. Because I am the one they thought would vanish forever. I am the one they dismissed, mocked, underestimated. Yet here I stand, unforgettable. Not because I fought to stay in their world, but because I dared to walk away and build my own. So when you find yourself at that crossroads, when betrayal, heartbreak, or cruelty pushes you to the edge, remember this. You don't always need to strike back. Sometimes the most powerful strike is silence. Sometimes, the greatest revenge is simply refusing to disappear. And that is my story. My quiet rebellion. My sweet, silent victory. And that's how the one they thought would vanish forever became unforgettable.